who's a scholar that needs no introduction to a lot of us. His work on how demographic shifts influence social changes are core texts in the majority of social inequality and social stratification courses. As a lot of you may know, Mike received his BA from the University of Pittsburgh and received his graduate MA and PhD from Indiana University. He served as a professor in the University of Arizona, UC Berkeley, and is currently in the Sociology department at NYU. Over the years, Mike has published widely and extensively in prestigious journals such as the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, and Demography. He has received several honors, and just to mention a few, his book, Century of Difference, received the Otis Dudley Duncan Award from the American Sociological Association. For his methodological accomplishments, he received the Clifford C. Cogg Award from the Population Association of America. And he was elected into the American Academy of Sciences for all the insights that he has provided us about social change and its implications for religion, politics, and inequality. Finally, I would like to conclude my introduction of Mike by sharing with you the event that made me a true Mike Hout fan. So in 2009, I attended a biodemography conference, and in this conference, the majority of the participants were male, and they tended to be more senior, and there were younger women who were attending this particular conference. During the first break, the men had hurdled around right in front of the men's room, and they were social networking, and Mike saw this, and he made a point out of breaking that particular hurdle, and throughout the entire conference, he made sure that women were integrated, and we were really heard throughout the conference. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Michael Hout.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's nice, and it's nice to be reminded of that meeting. I'm not a biodemographer, and you won't get any biodemography out of me today because it's not what I'm working on. But it was a great session, and I had actually forgotten that was one of the first times that I met you. Yeah. Most recently, and Kate reminded me of this too. We were at Rob Mayer's retirement party, so the connections go back to her student days. This is a great opportunity for me, not in the least because it's actually, I've got a result here I'm going to present today that is not in the abstract because it wasn't until I was making the slides for presentation here today that I even noticed this pattern in the data. So this is really work in progress. I encourage your questions and discussion of it and reserve the right to change things based on what you ask and what I say, and so it's somewhat provisional. In that spirit, I'm happy to take questions as I go along. You can ask a question if it's narrow and can be answered in a minute or two. I don't want you asking me why social mobility. Hopefully will emerge as I'm talking. But the technical question or something pressing that will help you understand or something that I went too fast, please slow me down with a question. I'm happy to interact, and we don't have to do it. I talk 45 minutes and then you ask for the rest of the time. I think we can do it a little more interactively. So the topic is narrowed now to just occupational mobility in order to fit in the new stuff. I had to ditch the income stuff, but hopefully if you're here just for the income, you're excused now. The main interest in this topic is this is something I've been interested in for quite a long time, but like sociology's collective interest, it kind of lagged for 15 years or so. We bumped up into a couple of data limitations that I'm going to enumerate for you as we go along, but interest has really spiked in the last 5 years, and in collaboration with some scholars here, we're trying to set up an international network to use new administrative data and tax records and census records in order to revive the study of this subject. But for today, I'm going to tell you about results that are based on the General Social Survey. I was co-principal investigator on the GSS for the last 10 years. I segued off that, hit the term limits September 1 of this year, and Steve Morgan has taken over for my slot on the PI team. But in my time as co-PI on the General Social Survey, we went back through all the verbatim text that we had collected over the years for occupational data, and this is the first substantive paper to emerge from that. We've gone through that, coded it all to a uniform scheme, and I'm going to be presenting new results based on it. So that the reason it starts in 1972 is not for any historical reason other than the fact that's when the data start. That's when the General Social Survey starts, so it's our first data point. 2016 is the most recent survey. We'll go into the field in February on the 2018 GSS. As I said, when I was in graduate school, this was the topic in quantitative social demography. Blau and Duncan, you're looking at Blau and Duncan's path model of the socioeconomic attainment process, where they decompose the correlation between fathers and sons' occupations into these paths that work through the schooling system and the career to make new insights into the way in which the intergenerational life cycle of inequality was produced in the United States. And it was all driven by a real simplification that took for granted that all we cared about was how sons reproduced or failed to the social position of their fathers. And that told us all we needed to know about society. It was a simplification when the project was started in 1962, and by the mid-90s it was an untenable way of thinking about social stratification, mainly because of rising women's participation in the labor force. It made for much more complexity in the social origins of people. It was easy to incorporate women's employment as an outcome. Current jobs of women, I did some of that work. Many people were engaged in incorporating women's occupations as an outcome. But managing the interaction and intersection between fathers and mothers was hard, and it was even harder because not everybody had both of them. Some had fathers and non-working mothers, some had working mothers and absent fathers, and it created a complexity that kind of stalled the entire enterprise. Economists have recently revived interest in this, and you've probably all seen or heard about this Great Gatsby curve. It was called by Alan Kruger, although the data were produced by Miles Korek. This is a chart from a paper of Miles's that show that cross-nationally the correlation between parents. Now we're looking at incomes, and incomes are handy because parents are kind of self-weighting in there. So the contribution of the mother and the father is proportional to their annual income, and so it just enters into the family income, the total family income, and if one or the other is missing, it doesn't matter. There's still a family income there, and that's the new simplification. And what has been observed is a correlation between the correlation and the degree of income inequality in the country. Countries with more, like the UK and the US, with more inequality of family income have a higher intergenerational correlation. Countries with less income inequality have a correspondingly, although not perfectly correspondingly, lower intergenerational correlation, which means more equality of opportunity. So there's both more equality of outcomes. Family incomes are more equally distributed in the countries on the lower left than the countries on the upper right, and also those countries that have high inequality of opportunity. What I'm going to show you today is a return to occupational mobility that puts that produces an estimate of intergenerational persistence in the United States, not too far from this data point here that Miles has on this great Gatsby curve, but in fact actually jacks it up just a little bit. I think the point there is about 0.45, 0.47. You're going to see estimates of greater than 0.5 for intergenerational persistence of occupation today. So if you got to leave, or if you doze off, I'm going to reproduce this data point and with a different kind of data, and most of the talk is going to be about how I came to that point estimate. The other main thing I'm going to show you today is that one might ask why, how the U.S. got to this point of such high intergenerational stability. When did it tick up? When did the growing inequality in the United States produce this inequality of opportunity in the United States? And the answer is, we can't tell, because as far back as 1972, I'm going to show you estimates that are in that range of 0.5. So while I'm going to show you evidence that supports this curve in the sense of the point estimate, the place where I put the US on the curve is going to be exactly where Korach did, or maybe just a little higher, closer to his line than, a little higher off the line than it appears here. I'm also going to tell you that back when US income inequality was closer to this 25, it was already up there. So the United States is riding high throughout the last 25 years and possibly even as long as the last 40 years. And so that's going to be the substantive conclusion of this. And why, you saw how demography counters inequality. The reason it hasn't risen as inequality is rising is because of those problems of family breakup and family disruption that I alluded to when I talked about the difficulty of measuring family background and talked about the inclusion of mother's occupation in the equation, and especially the inclusion of mothers who are mothering without a father's income in the household. That family disruption, it turns out, reduces the intergenerational correlation. It would be even higher if there was more family stability in the United States. And so what's keeping it in check is the rising trend of family breakup. So that's the short version. That's what the abstract should have said, but I didn't have all these results yet then. The data come from the General Social Survey. As I mentioned, I have had the privilege of, for the last 10 years, of being one of the co-PIs of that data set. It is a nationally representative sample of households, about 2,000 in recent, for half of the time series. It's only in the even numbered years. In the early days, there were about 1,200 interviews done in every year, and now we do about 2,500 in even numbered years. They're all done face-to-face. About a 70% response rate. Back in the early days, it was about 85%. Now it's about, I'm getting a little feedback here. Is everybody hearing this little whine? We have a dog whistle going on. Can we calm that down? And so now we're maintaining one of the highest response rates among non-government surveys anywhere, and we're quite proud of that. These data are drawn from that. The problem with the occupation data is that every time the Census Bureau changed the occupation scheme, the General Social Survey did too, so we could compare the quality of our sample with national statistics, so we had to use the same coding scheme. But what we've done in recent years is gone back to the original text, recoded everything to the contemporary scheme, and that's what I'm reporting on today, is this new perfectly integrated data, all of which are coded using the same procedures. I got a little into the research before myself. Let me tell you what the research questions are before I go into where the data come from. Saw the GSS, went off on GSS. The research questions start with Occupation is a qualitative thing. You know, we got carpenters, we've got farmers, we've got engineers, we've got physicians. We want to give each of them a score. What score are we going to give them? And we're going to end up using a 20-year-old suggestion that came from Bob Hauser and Rob Warren, that we rank order occupations based on their credentials. Why credentials and stuff, I'll hit you with that in a minute. We're going to end up combining mothers and fathers' occupations using a weighted average of those scores. We're going to give a score to mom, a score to dad. We're going to weight mom's score by 40% and dad's by 60%, based on some empirical results that I may give you a glimpse of. They're in the paper, but in the interest of time, I probably won't provide the full thing. Does family composition matter? Yes, it does. The intergenerational correlation is substantially weaker for single mom households compared to other kinds of households. And so, and it's also kind of hinted at by this 40% weight we give to mom. Mother's status is not passed on as directly as father's status, and when she's the only one there, then the family's status, she's the only one contributing to family status, and therefore it's a weaker association. Gender differences emerge in this. Previous work based on other scales found no gender differences. I'm going to show you gender differences. And in particular, the intergenerational correlation is bigger for the men than for the women. But I'm going to show you evidence that I'm going to show you no evidence of change over time, and I'm going to reach the conclusion that it's not because my evidence is weak, but rather because there is no change over time. And finally, though, there's an important other, in addition to family breakup, there's another institution that is contributing to holding down the intergenerational correlation between origins and destination, and that's education, and higher education in particular, university education. I first presented this, a version of this finding in 1984 that applied only to men, generalized it to men and women in 88. Haven't looked at it since, but Florencia Torche had a paper in 2011 in AJS where she looked at NLSY and a few other data sets and replicated my old result, and I'm going to show you a contemporary replication of it with these GSS data. Okay, scoring the occupations. 4 options. 1, we can use popular ratings. Who thinks this is a good job or a high status job? Who thinks this is a low status job? Just take the average of the population's view of things, rank order them, and use that as a score. This was sort of where the literature started back in the 60s. Actually, rating occupations goes back to the 19-teens. So over 100 years ago, people were doing this. And Don Tryman famously showed in the 1970s that these ratings are highly robust. He averaged all the ratings in all the world, 120 some studies, averaged them all together, and then for each one of the individual studies, he calculated a correlation between the aggregate international average and this particular study, and the average correlation was 0.86. On a scale from 0 to 1, it came in at 0.86. This is about as close to a constant as you can get in social science research. 0.86 correlation is not a constant, but it's as close as I've seen to it. And there's a lot of measurement error in it. We're just asking a cross-sectional slice to tell me about jobs, and they know about a carpenter and they can kind of guess about an engineer, but we're asking them questions about wood technologists and supervisors in paint thinner plants. We're asking them to make some rather fine distinctions here, and so there's lots of flex in that. So pretty early on, like 1958 or so, people started using census data to predict the ratings and replaced the subjective ratings with the predicted score from a regression that combined pay and credentials. This is the Duncan Socioeconomic Index, published in 1961 and updated perennially. And I started thinking that's what I was going to use, and I will actually show you 2 slides based on it. But for the most part, I'm shifting to the 1997 recommendation from Hauser and Warren, which is why average them together? just use the pay or just use the credentials. And it turns out that there's good evidence that scoring the occupations by their credentials produces a more reliable estimate of intergenerational mobility than does combining education and pay. And it's not that I believe education is more important than pay in the job, it's just that the rank ordering of the occupations according to their credentials is a more robust index of the thing we're trying to get at, the abstract, latent concept of best job, worst job, and that's why we're doing it. Also, I'm shifting. Their scale is based on started logits. Anybody in the room have a clue as to what that might be? It runs on a scale from -2 to +3, and a 1-point increase. You know, we're going to get a coefficient that says a 1-point increase in this thing is corresponds to a 0.5 increase for the kids' outcome, and nobody can intuit what this metric is. But if we rank order everything, and then I've got 539 occupations, so I rank ordered everything on this credential scale, divided by 5.4, 539, 5.4, that puts it on a scale that almost goes down to 0 and almost up to 100, and that's the score I'm going to use. So it's a 0 to 100 rank based score, and I'm going to refer to that as the credential rank of occupations. So that's my occupation measure. That's going to be on the midterm. To give you a feel, why am I bothering this? I tell you, first of all, that this prestige hierarchy is really robust over time and place, and then I said, oh, and by the way, we're doing this new interrogation of it and using a brand new set of occupational categories. Why are we doing it? There were 200 occupations in the 2010 U.S. Census Bureau's occupational scale, or occupational classification scheme, 200 out of the 539, that had never been rated by people by any kind of public representative rating sample, and some of them are kind of important occupations for the economy, including chief technology officer, an app designer, and radiation therapist, and so on. And so the 200 occupations, as well as the other, the 200 new ones, as well as the 350 continuing ones, were all rated in 2012, and so I've got scores that are appropriate to this occupational scheme that we're using here. Roughly, you know, a bunch of them are IT jobs, biomedical jobs, the hospitality industry. We didn't call hotels and restaurants that 25 years ago, but now it's the hospitality industry. They call themselves that. We've got organizational stuff, HR, sort of business, and then there are a bunch of new manual occupations as well. It's not all engineering and so on. Hazmat removal workers and satellite communications operators, and so on. These all needed to be ranked and rated. I want to point out, I mentioned the wood technologist before. This turns out to be the most underrated occupation, underrated in the sense that people think it's a mediocre job and low social standing, because you hear that and you think of a guy, you know, with a plane and a board and, you know, something like that. The wood technologist is actually the guy who makes IKEA furniture stand up. He's a chemist, or she. Wood technologists are chemists that are part engineer, part chemist, that turn wood chips into furniture. So this should be wood engineer or something like that, and then they get more appropriate scoring. Okay, I'm not going to go through the details of all this. Just note that when we look at all occupations, or just the recurring occupations, or just the new occupation, pay and credentials are pretty much equally contributing to the social standing of the occupation. So the dependent variable here is the popular rating that people gave to the occupation. The inputs are the percent above college, with some college, and the percent above average income in the census, in the most recent census, and it turns out those things predict the popular ratings pretty much equally, as they did in the original study by Duncan. I pulled out the health occupations to give you a little more texture on this. So we go from, and then they're ranked by this credential rank, which is my preferred scale on this, and there's a little bit of difference with the classic Duncan socioeconomic index and then the popular prestige. See, this is the error that ordinary people insert in the rank order of the occupations, is the way in which these things depart from this, is the way I'm viewing it. Now, you might have a different point of view. You might want to privilege the popular ratings, in which case the objective data on their pay and credentials is the error, and you can get the data from me and resort if you like. It's actually on the GSS website. But you go from the physicians and registered nurses at the top through counselors down to janitors and building cleaners and maids and housekeepers in health industry. So, you know, bedpan people. And in between, we've got assistants and secretaries and such like that. So there's an intuitive sense to this hierarchy. Probably don't want to go through too much of this either. The main point of this slide is to demonstrate that the credential ranks is the way to go. It generates the highest intergenerational correlation. These are our squares, so this corresponds to an intergenerational correlation of about 0.35, which is a traditional estimate for these kinds of data. Switching to the rank order bumps that up just a little bit. Might be closer to 0.38 or 39. Yeah, sure.
For the occupation, there's a lot of life cycle occupation change. What's the point at which you measure that?
So these people are 25 to 69 years old, but in the paper, but not in the talk, I've got this broken out by age. The intergenerational correlation is higher for people who are roughly 45 to 70 years old than it is for younger people. But we can't quite tell from this whether that's because the most recent cohort is a little more fluid, or more likely, I think, it's just that it takes the playing out of the career to fully reveal the advantages of the privileged background, or the disadvantage, the lack of trajectory over time among those who start out lowest. And so the gap over time emerges. My colleague Siwei Chang had a paper in AJS in 2014 where she showed that for NLSY data, and I think it probably is underlying what I'm seeing here as age patterns in this cross-sectional data. That's panel data, and so it's quite a bit stronger. But yeah, that's a long-winded answer. So we're averaging together the weaker correlation among the younger and the stronger correlation among the older in order to get to the overall point estimates I'm going to show you here. The pay scale performs the worst. This is bad news for Bob Ferry and a number of other people who have been using it for 19th century data. They need to know that they'll do better by ranking the occupations with credentials instead of pay. And when you average the two together to get the SEI, you get a number in between. Okay. Now, in a rank order scale, your intuition would be that all the ranks are equally likely in the population. But I have this slide is just here to remind you that I've rank ordered the occupations as 539 discrete units. Some of them are tiny, some of them are huge. And so the distribution of occupational status in the workforce is not uniform by this scoring, but rather shows the prevalence of a couple of really big occupations, especially for the women and the mothers. And that's going to become an important part of the story of why the transition from mother's occupation to either her daughter's or her son's occupation is weaker than the transition from the father to the daughter or son, because the men and the fathers are more dispersed across this occupational landscape, occupational segregation. These are secretaries and other office workers, very highly prominently clustered for the moms, somewhat clustered for the daughters, and as are domestic, these are the janitors and housemaids from that previous slide in all industries, and that it's quite a spike for moms, half as big a spike for the daughters. But the occupational clustering for women is much greater than for men. So we're going to start with father-to-son mobility and cover the whole 72 to 1994. Oh yeah, one last thing. We didn't ask about moms' occupations in the General Social Survey until 1994. And I can't account for the period before 1993 because I was not part of the project until then. And at my first meeting, I made the case for adding mother's occupation to it, and I take full credit for convincing a majority of the board to add it, despite the fact that it was expensive and they were spending most of the meeting getting rid of items, not adding items. But fortunately, we've got this item. So, the analysis of the contribution of mothers to intergenerational mobility will start with 1994, and it'll start in about 5 slides. But first I'm going to go through the longer-term father-to-son transmission. This is the standard way of proceeding. We do ordinary least squares, which is based on means, and so I thought, for your edification, to make sure everybody knows what I'm doing and how this thing works, I'm going to put up a chart that shows the means for 20 bins. So I just, every 5 points on the scale, I calculated mean from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, etc., all the way up to 96 to 100, and plotted the means. And a couple of things jumped out at me. One is that, first of all, the means rise as they should, about 35 points as you go across the 100 points on the scale. We're going to get a slope of about 0.35 for these data, which is what ordinary least squares regression normally shows for data of this type. So that's not a surprise. There's this funny little dip here at farm, which means we've probably overestimated the social standing of farmer fathers. And we do better sliding them a little bit to the left. So all the multivariate analysis from here on is going to have a dummy variable for farmer father that allows for the fact we misplaced the farmers. And there are lots of them. You can see these, every little smudge on this data plot represents a case. There are 28,000 dots on here, and this high density of dots, I jittered them just a little bit, and made them partly transparent. So as they get darker, it's indicating that there's more of them, and this is farmer fathers, and there's lots of them, especially in the 1970s. There's also lots of carpenter, semi-skilled worker fathers in this zone, and so that's important. There's actually a lot of clustering in a sort of blue-collar, unskilled, semi-skilled zone of short-distance blue-collar mobility, all of which lies below the means, mysteriously. And a bit of a hint, this is like looking at the first X-rays, they're a little hazy. But there's a bit of a hint of something going on there. And actually, you can spot the diagonal. There's net of everything else, there is a tendency of father-son correspondence. My dad was a X and so am I kind of situation. From the top to the bottom, it's pretty, but it seems to be a bit more prominent both at the top and bottom than here in the middle. It gets a little lost. But there's not a lot of dads in this zone, so I can't tell if it's a prevalence thing or not. Anyway, this is the chart that made me change the whole talk, because I said, look at this massive data down below these means. The regression line is going to pass through these balls, and there's some interesting systematic looking evidence down here. Where are the medians? Oh, first we have to look at the farmers. There they are, they're in green. Farm laborers and farmers. Here are the medians. So the medians produce a line that runs up at a slope closer to 0.5, which is what we get when we average together 5 or 6 or 9 years of parents' income and 5 or 6 or 9 years of respondents' income and correlate those two things. In other words, we can reproduce the intergenerational correlation typical of the best of the intergenerational income mobility studies with 1 year of occupation data by tracking the median occupational standing instead of the mean occupational standing. We get the same estimate. We can reproduce their estimate with this technique. And what that means is when we go back to the really old census data, the 19th century census data, where we know nothing about people's incomes, but we do have their occupation at quite a bit of detail, typically 80 to 150 detailed occupational titles, we can apply this same method there and recover from the 19th century data the signal about what was 19th century social mobility like in America, as opposed to having to rely just on this last quarter of the 20th century, first 16 years of the 21st. We haven't gotten down to this father equals son line, but we are, the medians are pulling down toward it. And this is like first week homework in basic stat. You know, you've got a skewed distribution, and the mean is, if it's skewed this way, the mean is above the median. And likewise, if you've got it skewed like this, then the mean is, I'm doing this wrong. No, the mean is below the median. And that's exactly what it is for these low origin sons. They've got this skewed distribution, and this one guy up here, actually it's like four physicians and lawyers are dragging the mean up to overlap them, and meanwhile this cook at probably, you know, Chez Panisse or some fancy restaurant, but this cook is dragging down the mean for the sons of the privileged, and therefore we do better tracking the medians instead of the means. And that's like the news here, and call me a nerd, but I got all excited. And I want to thank you, because I was ready to write the paper before I made that plot, but I wasn't ready to give the talk until I made that plot. And once I made that plot, then I had to rewrite the paper. So, what else? So the slope estimates are 60% higher, 0.52. using the medians instead of the mean. So it's a quantile regression right in the middle at the 50 percentile, and we get a slope of 0.52. Okay, so that's the story on the men. Another figure, oh yeah, right, and it turns out it doesn't depend on this scale I just made up for the purposes of this paper. The rank order credential scale, nobody's seen before. It might be an artifact of it. It's a little stronger using the rank order credential scale, but here I've reproduced it with the standard Duncan SEI. And you know, what are my slopes here? 0.43 and 0.29. So they're a little lower, but the difference is still present. The main issue, the problem of skew, high and low, is reproduced in the SEI data, and tracking the medians gives us an estimate that is that corresponds better with the income estimates than tracking the means does. So it's not a scaling artifact. So then I'm all set. Okay, let's do this. Let's reproduce it for every year of the GSS and see how much it's changed over time. And the answer is not at all. So here are all the, you know, the annual estimates are noisy. They bounce up and down. So I smooth them, and it's not flat. but it's not much different than 0.5 in any of those years. These are the OLS estimates. They're also flat, so that the flatness is not an artifact of using the medians instead of the means. It's also reassuring to see that the artifact is not, or sorry, that the median effect is not peculiar to any particular mean. There is, any particular year. I don't think there's a single, no. There isn't a single median estimate that is below the corresponding mean estimate, the corresponding OLS estimate. So in every replication, I'm getting this same skew matters result and a steeper slope based on the medians than based on the means. Everybody still with me? This is like the thickest, most methodologically dense part of the talk, and now we're going to get back to substance of family composition and gender differences and stuff. So if you've got a question about how am I doing this, now's the time to ask it. Yes?
I had a question about
good, I can use a glass of water.
Inflation. That is, I assume you're taking the credentials that people actually have, not those that are required for the job. And
nobody has any idea of what's required for the job. I could do a whole lecture on that.
so what does how does credential inflation play into this? If there's more credential inflation over time?
Yeah, I don't believe there is any credential inflation at all. College-educated people just are better employees than people who are not college-educated. And I think employers have proved that by paying them more. And it's not just norms. And no, I don't know of no business owner who would pay anybody anything to be politically correct. I think probably some people are underpaid, but nobody's... no college graduate is overpaid just on account of their sheepskin. But that's the other lecture. Functionally what I did here was I've got occupations that are defined relative to 2010, and I use the credentials that correspond to those occupations in the American Community Survey, which is the equivalent of the long form, and you guys have a different name for it here, but it's basically the same thing. A sample estimate centered on 2010. So 2008 up to 2012. Combine all those years, and so for every occupation I get the percent with some college. But I don't think that actually this score, I'm not interpreting it as a substantive education thing. It's just a tool to rank order the occupations, the social standing of the occupations. And so that's the latent quantity I'm going for. This is a handy, convenient, and best performing among the three options I have version of it. But it is not the, I don't think that it's intrinsically an education measure, because among other things, both registered nurses and physicians, 99.9% of both have some college education. But there's additional educational information that we're not putting into the rank ordering, but is substantively important, and in a minute you're going to see the people's actual educational achievement. But that's its own variable in the analysis. It's an individual level variable in the analysis. This is just a way of saying this occupation is higher than that occupation. And the metric that I'm using to make that assertion is the credential, but it's not, I don't think it's essentially an education-related finding. It's just, there's probably less measurement error in it. There's less annual fluctuation in education, for example. You know, pay bounces around a lot, which is why the good income studies average together 5, 6, 9 years of education. 9 years of incomes in order to do them, to get out those little annual fluctuations. Okay. Other questions on the how we doing this part? Yeah, Anders.
Can you compare median and OLS? Are they on the same scale?
Yes, yeah, they're on the same scale. The quantile regression is what both of them are doing. The slope of the line here, because of the convenient, that's the socioeconomic reproduction. Because the scale is on 0 to 100, the change from the bottom, the intercept, up to the maximum observed, divided by 100 is the slope in both of these. The Bayesian procedure that underlies quantile regression is beyond the scope of this talk, but is something that anybody can look up, and it's got its own, quantile regression has its own Wikipedia page, and it's accurate as near as I can tell. It is a Bayesian technique for that pools local estimations and then comes up with a single coefficient for the line, and then generates predicted scores exactly the same way OLS does. There's a constant, there's an x value, and it's beta times x plus the constant is the predicted score there. Just the same as the OLS line. So yes, the short answer is yes, same metric. Yeah, we can compare one with the other. And even if we couldn't, your eye can compare this steeper line with that shallower line. These are expected values under it. Whoop, almost. Okay. So now let's get to the demography. How is demography countering rising inequality? We know from the Gatsby curve there's rising, well, not from the Gatsby plot there, but it's famously true that in almost all advanced countries, income inequality is greater now than it was 25 years ago. So that correspondence between income inequality and mobility in the Gatsby curve, which is cross-sectional, implies that as income inequality in the United States has grown, there should have been an increase in intergenerational persistence, but we didn't see that. We saw flat lines. And so the puzzle to be solved is what is countering it? What is working against the rising inequality to mute its impact on inequality of opportunity or generational inequality? And the answer is going to be family breakup and higher education, college education. Here's the family breakup part. First, well, also the emergence of women into the labor force, but that's kind of justifying the focus on mothers as well as fathers from a different angle, and really isn't part of the explanation. But the part that is part of it is down here, the fraction of people who are in mother-only households. It rises from 25 to, what is that, 32% or 35% over this time frame. And what I'm going to show you is that the intergenerational beta is lower in these kinds of households, and they're more prevalent. Therefore, if inequality is pushing up the intergenerational correlation, this other factor is pushing it down. And somehow they're both in this kind of oddly steady equilibrium that yields no net change. And that's kind of the gist of the second part of my title, how demography counters the effect of inequality. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 5 or 6 slides. Kate.
So Mike, what are you doing with immigration between 76 and 2000?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Finish your question.
73 and 2016, there's a lot more immigrants in the state.
Yep.
Immigrants may have higher instances of intergenerational mobility, and that may contribute to the fact that there's no change despite the fact that you're seeing a bipolarization of the economy.
Yeah, so I meant to put it on all the slides. I only have it on this one. We asked, where'd you grow up? And people tell us which state they grew up in. And if they said Hong Kong, Korea, Mexico, they're not in the analysis. So this is only because the social origin, this is also the kids. When we ask about the parents' income, it's what were your parents doing while you were growing up? And if they say, well, lots of stuff, what year are you talking about? We say, oh, I don't know, about when you were 16. And so this is also for people who moved around a lot. Where were you living when you were in high school? What were your parents doing when you were in high school? This is when those life-determining or life-inflecting choices are made. And so that's when we're measuring both of these variables. And so if they were being made, oh yes, we're in Mexico deciding to come here, we don't know how to calibrate that occupation that mom and dad were doing. We don't know how to calibrate those educational credentials that were accumulated. So at this point, it's about the not U.S. born, but U.S. educated population, I guess is the way to think about this. Yeah. Even these stats apply to the U.S. educated population. Other question? That was a great question, yeah, and I'm sorry I left that out. I should have said that already. Yes, sir.
So one of the things I was thinking, it's not as drastic as the rise of single motherhood, but it's men's unemployment. And I was wondering sort of if you thought that was,
Unfortunately, you know, we don't have employment histories for these folks. What we have is today's adults' recollection of what their parents were doing when they were in high school, and very, very few of them say, sitting on the couch, looking for work. They say, he was a carpenter. They might even say unemployed carpenter or unemployed bus driver or whatever. But they give us an occupation. And so we don't observe the spells and the dips in people's trajectories and backgrounds. Obviously the 2008-9 recession and its aftermath that lasted up until roughly 2012 was huge, but that's not most of these parents are parenting these respondents in the 70s and 80s. And so there were recessions, the serious recession, 81, 2, 3, but that's getting elided here. They're just telling, he was working at a bank, managing a branch or something like that. Oh yeah, and that bank went out of business the next year because it was actually a savings and loan. We missed that. Yes?
Do you interact race with this?
In a minute.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. And it turns out that's a great word to use, interact, because these estimates would all be off if the rates were, if the slopes were different for African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, whites, but in fact, they're all parallel at different levels. So they are not actually interactions, but rather additive effects. And so these are, we're doing fine estimating the slope. We're fuzzy on the intercept, and I'm going to take care of that in a minute.
Where I was going to go, just to interject one little thing, is we know about mass incarceration of African Americans in the United States, and that, of course, interrupts your occupational path, right?
Yes, it does.
So,
or keeps it from ever getting started is actually the most pernicious part of it. It's mostly young men who are then, apropos Diva Page's work, permanently knocked out of the workforce. And Page or Western, a number of people have written important papers on this subject. In these data, because it's household-based data, we're just like the current population survey, we're missing the incarcerated population. If they're on the father's side, they show up as single mom households, and if it's the respondents, we just miss them. They're not in the data set. Okay. So this is, and I put my phone away and that clock has not moved. So I've used 0 time. Huh? 2:54, and I should sort of wrap up in, I'll say I'll wrap up in 5 or 6 minutes. So let me know when we pass the top of the hour. Just, give me a 3 wave there. All of you can do it. I'll call on you, but all right. So this is the key. This is father-son, father-daughter, mother-son, mother-daughter mobility. These are charts that look a lot like the previous charts, with the median lines drawn, the quantile regression lines drawn. Now we've gotten rid of those unreliable means. So this is what we've already seen. Father, son, slope of 0.5. Father-daughter, it's weaker. And the action, and the reason I'm showing you not only just slope estimates, but the scatter is the answer is in the scatter. Remember I pointed out how concentrated and clumpy women's occupations are. The occupational segregation of women is mainly producing this result. I have to pardon my back, but I have to turn around to do this. This huge clustering of women, especially lower origin women, in office work, secretary, receptionist, and so on, which is in the middle of the credential hierarchy, right about 50 on this scale I'm using, puts the women right there in the middle, and disproportionately the women doing this job are the women with blue-collar fathers. I mean, there are some, physician, lawyer daughters, daughters of physicians and lawyers who are also doing that work, but this is a much denser pocket back here. And for their brothers, male cousins, they're down here in these blue-collar, carpenter, building trades kinds of occupations, and meanwhile the girls are in the office. And so that's pulling them up from a score in the zone of 20 to a score in the zone of 50. And that's coming through here then as a shallower line. Upgrading the bottom, sticking the top about the same level. Actually at the top, the men have higher scores than the women. So the lines cross if I put them both on the same line, on the same chart. But if I put them on the same chart, we lose this concentration of women in those employments. This is school teachers. They're also a popular destination for women, and they're also showing up here across the board. Lots of blue-collar daughters teaching in schools. And so that's that story, and it's a shallower slope. In the summary that I gave you earlier on, I pointed out that less intergenerational transmission for women. This is where this is where scale matters. If I use the SEI at this point, these are high credential, low pay occupations. And therefore, if I put the socioeconomic index there that averages pay and credentials, then suddenly these women are showing up with a score of about 35, not a score of 50, and we get a steeper slope. And so the gendered gap in the slope, the greater intergenerational transmission for men, shows up in the credential scale, but not in the socioeconomic scale. If we average pay and credentials, we get this result. And corresponding, if you're following at home with your arithmetic, your little weighted average calculator in the back of your brain, you're saying, oh, that also means then that the slope is steeper the pay slope is steeper for the women than for the men. Because to average out to be the same, when we average them for the socioeconomic index, that means the slope's got to be steeper. The pay slope is steeper for the women than for the men, and that's true. I'm not going to show you that slide, but that's true. Mom, the slope here for mother-son is just slightly and not statistically significantly weaker for the men, and ditto the mother-daughter is not statistically significantly different than the father-daughter one. But both of these are slightly less steep. And again, it's the concentration of mothers and just the clumpiness of the mother data. We're not getting as much leverage on this intergenerational persistence for moms. Here's the race, interacted with race. These are fits that are specific to each group. They differ in the intercept, but not in the slope. These differences among the slopes are not statistically significant. In fact, my eye can't even see them. What's important to note, although we're losing some of the data, on my laptop there's a bit more resolution and we can see a bit more of the data. Looks like we almost have no Hispanic men up here. There really are, but we just can't quite see because they're not overlapping as much. But we have significantly fewer both black and Hispanics in the two-parent households, and the Hispanics are concentrated in the mother occupation missing, although you really lose that here, and the blacks are concentrated in the father occupation missing category. We lost that detail here because of dropout on the, you just need one of those fancy screens on a fancy new laptop to see them. Racial differences are additive. The questioner and I understand what that means, but what that means is the slopes are the same across groups. It's just that the African Americans are significantly lower at every given level. Interestingly enough, the intercepts are the same for Hispanics as for whites, which means that they are the difference on average between Hispanic and white adult social standing is due to the lower social origins, lower standing of the fathers and mothers' occupations of the Hispanics, and there's not a residual difference between the two groups. Asians aren't here because even on my laptop the data look really sparse, but their slope also is not significantly different from the slopes of the other three groups. I think I made my points. Now we update this to look at change over time in the more complicated model, and again we find no change over time. So the main finding of no change over time ports over here, but the men are at a higher level than the women. And that's true in every single year. Again, for the more complicated model, we have to start in '94 when we got mom for the first time. Finally, to education, I published a chart that looked very much like this, without the scatter, just the slopes, in AJS in 1988. And at that point I argued that college is a great equalizer, that origins no longer matter when you've got a credential to throw on the table. That prior to that, employers are looking for information about you in your experiences as reflected in your resume, your presentation of self as represented in your dress, in your accent, in other observables about you. But throw down that sheepskin and now that background doesn't matter anymore. The chances of getting into a high status occupation are the same for somebody who's the son or daughter of a dishwasher, truck driver, carpenter, shopkeeper, secretary, school teacher, physician, lawyer. They're all the same. But your odds of getting that sheepskin are a whole lot higher if your parents are of high status than if they aren't. So we see a high density of dots here and not so dense here. We see a high density of dots here. These are the women, obviously. But we see a high density of dots here, a declining density, nothing, and nothing. Because these people from these origins who get this level of education rise up, but there are few of them. There are fewer dots along this school teacher line at the low end than at the high end. There are fewer dots on this half of the chart here than there are on that side of the chart there and there, because the educational system itself is selective, but conditional on passing that selection bar, your background gets canceled out. So it's a very subtle kind of interaction, but a powerful one. This has been replicated. Richard Breen replicated this in 6 other countries. Not Canada. I've never seen anybody try for Canada. Somebody looking for a master's paper topic, and failed to reproduce it in 4. So Breen tried it in 10 countries, got 6 replications and 4 failures to replicate. I've lost track of the list of countries for which that worked out, but it's a pretty robust but not universal finding is the upshot of it. And I believe that's the end. So in combination, family disruption is disrupting the ability of families to reproduce their status. And education as an institution is in this complicated relationship where highly selecting individuals into success in the educational system, it is reproducing educational inequality, intergenerational inequality. But when people beat the odds and get the college degree despite their low origins, they're treated by the labor market the same way as high origin people. And so those are my two explanations for why the change over time has not been more abrupt, why the rising inequality has not produced more inequality of occupational opportunity. It's because we also have countervailing factors of more family disruption and more college graduation. And with that, I'm done. And it's your turn to ask those bigger questions. Or smaller ones, I don't care.
So you could go back to the education stuff you just showed.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is consistent with, this is also consistent with the fact that people of lower social origin, that one. That's consistent with people at lower social origin being more and more selected. So they are on unobserved characteristics, they differ more and more across education outcomes. So basically,
college is like the same stuff employers do. Yeah. People who show up, people who sit still, people who take notes, and all that stuff.
But
and so they
weight the questions differently. So the questions are weighted differently across the education group. So if you weight it, you might get the same steep slope. So you might actually have.
If we could somehow remove, if we could somehow predict using grades and test scores and parents' education and so on, predict who's high propensity to achieve, to get a college degree and who has a low propensity of getting a college degree, then we could see if these interactions are in fact really interactions or just a consequence of the selectivity of the colleges and universities. Frankly, from my point of view, I'm fine if it's just sort of aligned selectivity and that's all we're picking up. But in fact, the results that Brandon Shea have gotten and a number of other people have gotten where you align people on that predicted probability of being admitted to college. I can't do that with these data. I don't know people's test scores and so on. But when they match people according to their propensity to get a college degree and then observe whether they do or they don't, they find what they call negative selection, that actually the kid who benefits the most from a college degree is the one who is the last admitted, not the first. That the real action in college education in the United States is not the kid who's trying to decide to invent Facebook before or after graduating from Harvard, but the kid who whose life choice is, do I finish this and manage the local Coke bottling plant, or do I drive a truck out of it? And that's where high school versus college is really different. And it's for that kid who is the unlikely college graduate for whom the payoff of the college degree is actually higher. Yeah, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Given the trends that have occurred over time in job switching behavior, so you have this steady downward trend in job switching behavior across generations, I would have expected to see the correlation between parental credentials and the credentials of kids grow over time, but it didn't really seem that was the case. I mean, you can't necessarily look at it with longitudinal data, but have you had a chance to take a look at that? Yeah,
so I'm going to unpack your question two ways. One is, this is not the credentials of the parents or the credentials of the kid. This is their occupational social standing as ranked by the credentials. So think of it as, how good is their job?
Right. Okay.
Good job, crummy job, son, good job, crummy job, parents combined, averaged together. And no, that correlation hasn't changed much over time. Is it because we're only getting 1 year's employment on the respondent? Or is it because, and we're kind of thinking that in the background, the respondent's sort of averaging the parents' career together. We ask them, when you're growing up. And then only if they get fussy and say, well, what do you mean? She did like 9 jobs. She sold shoes, she was a receptionist, blah, blah, blah. When you were in high school. When you were 16, if they keep coming back, we narrow them down. But we start with while you're growing up. So they're doing a kind of career averaging of the parents. We don't have career averaging for the respondents themselves. We just know, what were you doing last week? And if it was looking for work, what was your most recent occupation before you lost it? And so we're not capturing that career dynamic. But in the cross-section, we should be capturing the one who just moved up and the one who just moved down. And if they're of comparable origins, we're getting the median of their status. Yeah, behind you, and then I'll get.
I don't know if I need a microphone. I was just going to ask about cohort differences, if you think that
there
are cohort differences.
I don't think there are, but I'm going to systematically do that next. I have not yet done this.
Why not? Why wouldn't there be?
Why wouldn't there be cohort differences? Because that's a good question. Actually, yeah, why don't I expect to see cohort differences? Yeah, I probably should. If I paid attention to my own argument, the most recent cohorts both are more likely to have graduated from college and more likely to have a single mom. So they should have weaker associations. They should also, they've been also exposed to a higher inequality regime, so they should have higher. But yeah, it's indeterminate. I need to do that.
How are you taking into account family dynamics? Are you only asking about biological parents who were co-residing when these people were at home, or?
They're actually the social parents who were co-residing when they're at home. We are going to ask for the very first time in 2018 about biological parents when they aren't the same as those parents who were co-residing. So we don't know anything about biological parents. All we know are the co-residing parents.
Co-residing social parents when they were adolescents.
Yeah.
So an absent parent who may have been influential but didn't live in the house isn't in this equation at all.
Correct. As is, and similarly, the absent parent who was consequential and the present parent who was not consequential. We don't know anything about that.
Thanks.
You see a hand. I don't see the hand. Oh, all the way over here. Sorry.
When you're referring here to the credentials score, you say some college degree, and advanced degree. Now in the States, you have associate's degrees, so what we would consider a 2-year college, and then a university. Did you notice any difference between any of that?
Okay, yeah, so this is the worker's own individual level education that's running across the top here. So all these people are college graduates. I pooled all these folks together, and even because it is a cross-sectional survey, in the 70s hardly anybody had a 2-year degree. In the most recent data, it might be there might be enough cases here to pull out those with a credential and those who don't have. And it might be quite interesting. I guess my expectation, if I could do it, if you'll indulge me for a second, would be that for those who just drop out without any credential, the slope would look more like it does among the high school graduates, and those who have a credential, it would be approaching the flatness of the college graduates. But I haven't actually attempted that, in part because it's only in 2006 to 2016 that we have even asked, do you have an associate's degree? So it's only in the very most recent data that I could even do that, but it is 10 years of data. Maybe I could pull that off. Yeah.
So it sounds like you've tried to measure the parent's occupation at a particular point when the kid was 16.
Yeah.
So you've got that occupation at that point in the life cycle, whatever that was for that kid. But then you've got the respondents at a wide variety of ages.
Correct.
Can you do some age correction for the, can you do some age correction for the respondent part to make sure you're getting the, because for the person who's going to be relatively young, they haven't perhaps reached.
Right.
Ideally, you'd kind of want to get them at the same age as what you were taking.
Yeah, right. In previous work, I've done that. I haven't done that here on this sample, but Siwei Cheng and I are using the PSID data to attempt to do that. So but that's a different data set and so on. But it'll inform the substantive conclusion, but I'm not going to be able to do it here.
Okay, and then just to follow up to that, when you're showing the period over time.
Yeah.
I'm not a demographer, so I don't know exactly how this goes, but if there's an increase in the age gap, if the parents are having the kids at a later age, then there should be some kind of systematic effect there because you're taking the second kid's occupation at a systematically difference from the parents.
Yeah, which is
over time.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's even more interesting and difficult than your intuition suggests, because there's a social class gradient in how old the parents are having the kid. So the teenage births are occurring to people who are going to end up with these lower socioeconomic status ranking in the on this scheme, and those who are having their kids in their late 30s are disproportionately people who are here. And so there are part of the privilege of the privileged and the disadvantage of the disadvantaged is that the disadvantaged they have parents that are not only low achievers but also really young, and those who have privileges, among their privileges are included the fact they've got experienced parents who are at the peak of their earnings trajectories while they're trying to choose a college. And all of that is added into this, this effect I have here. And with these data, I don't know how old the parents were when the respondent was born. We asked them, what was your date of birth? We don't ask them, what was your parents' date of birth? But this project that I'm engaged in with the US Census Bureau will allow us to do that kind of calculation. But for right now, with these data, we will not be able to do it. Yeah, Rachel.
The fact that the fitted line for women is so much higher than the line for men for the highest degrees and the lowest degrees.
Yeah, they're school teachers instead of secretaries, but there's enough noise here that they're both, neither is different from zero. But the intercept is kind of higher there, but that's probably mostly noise. But we've pretty much gotten rid of this clustering phenomenon, and now it's the clusterings up here for the girls, and presumably similarly here. We're running out of cases up here at the top. I think you're best off just thinking of these lines as absolutely flat. Yeah. Yes, Sarah?
Kind of a question that follows up on that is if you go back to the slide with it's broken down by men.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, that one. There's quite a lot of missing. There's no, the lower level corner or the right top corner.
Right.
Start on that because there's higher education, right? So kind of that it's higher educated fathers, those fathers are not holding those status more than for men.
But the slope is steeper for the men, maybe because of the concentration of men down here. I don't know, but it may. And I've been focused on the low end of the women's line there, and the concentration in office work. But perhaps there is also a story of the avoidance of factory and the corresponding avoidance of factory and lower service work among the daughters of the privileged. Yeah, the privileged daughters. I don't know how to say that. Yeah, you can spend a lot of rainy afternoons just like going over these, and there is way more to be learned. And you know, I don't beat up my colleagues in public, but so you guys must be my colleagues now, because you know we should have thought of this years ago. I should have thought of this in 1988, because we were fitting at that time a certain kind of statistical model that Leo Goodman had taught us to use that involved removing the cases along the diagonal. Quasi-independence models is what they were called. And thus only estimating the slope after removing this tendency. And that, the existence of that tendency and the focus that some of us, including myself, paid to those diagonal parameters was a hint that there's interesting action below the line at the low end and above the line at the high end. We should have shifted the medians like a generation ago. This was a finding just sitting there ready to be found, you know, beeping at us, all but beeping at us, and nobody saw it. You know, we just all looked right past it. We had these two kinds of models. We incorporated it in the analyses involving categorical data and ignored it when we came to this and just automatically typed in REG, you know, or OLS, and off to the races. And we were wrong to do that. Yeah.
It's hard to tell from this plot, but are there any patterns that you noticed on the extreme cases? So, you know, super low occupation, mother, father, and then the kids do much better intergenerationally?
I have not gotten into that that level, but what I have my research assistant looking for is an optimal sorting algorithm that we can place to this that will generate a scatter plot that makes the correlation absolutely the strongest possible for these data, and then we'll just list those occupations and go through that chart looking to see which are the surprisingly high or surprisingly low occupations that emerge from that fit. But I don't know how to do that, and you know, she's looking for it, and you know, one of these days she'll find it and we'll get it, and we'll have a scatter plot that's sort of no name on the X and Y axis, just, you know, optimally sorted origins and destinations, and then we'll look at the names on those occupations and figure out if there's any news there, or if it's all physician, lawyer, judge, college professor, and you know, cook, maid, bottle washer.
Because it may be if you looked at something like ONET, you would be able to look at some of the skills that are inherent in each of these occupations, and maybe those are being transferred.
Yeah, so in the recoding we did in fact capture that 6-digit number that ONET is indexed on, and so yeah, somebody will one of these days do a master's paper on that one. You know, match all this to ONET and do a kitchen sink, see if we get anything. You know what a kitchen sink is? It's where you take everything but the kitchen sink and you throw it in the regression equation. Yeah, okay. You know, this is a metaphor I heard in college, so I wanted to make sure that it's still alive enough.
So you eliminated cases where that they were not living in the U.S. at the time of the survey, right?
Not at the time. Yeah, the survey itself eliminates people who aren't living in the U.S. at that time. We also eliminate people who were not living in the U.S. at the time of secondary school because we didn't know what to make of their occupations.
So we have immigrants that are. So this doctor comes in and he's a cab driver in the U.S. What do his kids remember him being? A cab driver or a doctor?
Yeah,
that would be a very interesting sub-analysis of it.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, yeah, hadn't occurred to me, but yeah, that's great. I chaired Aziza Kazum's dissertation at Berkeley, and she looked at, during the early founding of Israel, in the very first, I guess it was an analysis of the 1960 Israeli census. She looked at country of origin, and she found lots of patterns where people who had European professional credentials were working in that profession, and people who had Middle Eastern professional credentials were, as you say, driving trucks and driving taxis, and wrote a very interesting dissertation on that, but it never occurred to me to do it for the US data.
I imagine, say, that child that is a son or daughter of this doctor cab driver may have different aspirations than of the son or daughter of the cab driver.
For sure, yeah, and yeah, no, that's a really interesting idea. Thank you. Yes.
So the finding that mother's occupation has a weaker correlation with the son and daughter's occupation, how might same-sex parent households affect that?
Yeah, we really have no idea. You know, there are probably 5 cases in the data. And we wouldn't know it. I guess they would probably describe, there's just no, they're probably under other, and the interviewer typed in some description, but I haven't gone through that category. But in 20 years, it'll be interesting when it's a much more prevalent outcome. Because remember, these people are 25 to 69 years old. Even in 2016, there's going to be vanishingly few who grew up with 2 moms or 2 dads. But in 20 years, that'll be much more prevalent. Yeah, when working on a generational scale, you have to remember, 25 years, 30 years earlier than these people, and the youngest people would only be the ones affected. Yeah, it's just, I don't know about this country, but certainly in the US, it was not prevalent in the 1970s, let alone the 1940s, when some of these people, the people we interviewed in 1970 were raised in the first half of the 20th century. Other questions? Which then allows me to say one more small thing about the other factor mitigating the impact of inequality on social mobility is the different clocks that we're measuring inequality and mobility on. This intergenerational analysis is in fact looking at mostly at conditions that are 50 to 20 years before the time of measurement. So, these data points I have for 1994, 1996, 1998 are talking about, on average, people who were growing up in the 60s. And so it's the inequality of the 60s that are informing them, and it's the inequality of the 80s that are in these people's background. So it might be too soon to detect the impact of the run-up of inequality, which runs basically 1980 till now. None of these people were kids, well, not none. The very youngest of these people were kids in the regime of high inequality. And so that time scale is perhaps also, in addition to demography countering the impact of inequality, it might be time itself is mitigating our ability to see inequality's effects, because these are people who were growing up, mostly growing up before the inequality was having its full force of effects. Yeah.
So your comment brings me to the question of wealth as opposed to occupation.
Yeah.
And that really is what's driven the huge change in inequality. not so much about occupational variations as it is about wealth accumulation.
Sort of. There's enough growth in family income inequality to have had noticeable and substantial effects if they exist. But certainly wealth inequality was higher, even in the 70s, than family income inequality, and has risen apace. That's all true, and in fact has risen somewhat faster. And so that's an important part of it. But once you put wealth in, you really lose your tag on time, because the social value and the economic leverage of wealth is that you get to use it when you want to, not when you have to, or you can use it when you absolutely have to and it will go away. But that then gives a parent a nest egg of wealth inherited from a parent or embedded in a housing bubble, gives one parent an opportunity to draw down on that wealth by converting it into cash that they then pay as tuition to a college, and their sister, who is in another town where the housing bubble is not as high, can't do that. And that might then be a way in which intergenerational wealth operates that is invisible, completely invisible to this. We would have to, it's already a 90-minute interview. The Survey of Consumer Finance, which is the main source of information about wealth of American households, is itself a 2-hour interview, and requires, and then they don't measure anything else interesting. So it's hard to use to correlate it with anything else. There are wealth modules in the PSID that give us some, but mostly what they have instructed us on is how fungible, flexible, and powerful wealth is, because it sits there accumulating and having zero effect until it can have a maximal life-changing effect. And so we never quite get to see it operating in any of the cross-sections we're looking at. And we would really need some sort of whole life, or as Rob Mayer has argued, dynastic analysis to see the impact of this advantage that might play out immediately on the kids, might play out on their kids, or even 2 generations down the pike. And we're just not anywhere near being able to do that with the data we have in hand. Doesn't mean it's not important, and is why, a correlation of between 0.36 and 0.5 is interesting and important, but it's, even at 0.5, it's explaining a quarter of the variance in outcomes. And so there's a whole lot going on here. How is it that, this pair of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and a college degree, one is working in an office and the other's up here either teaching school or a high school principal or a lawyer or a judge, what differentiated those 2 people? Well, we don't know, because conditional on all the key observables, they look the same except on the outcome, and their outcomes are substantially different. And so that's why we're only explaining a quarter of the variance. Yes. So behind you first.
So you mentioned that the intergenerational inequality does not change over time, but I want to know that whether the 2007-2008 financial crisis in the United States has ever affected the intergenerational inequality a little bit, because some new jobs in the finance area or some IT jobs may be affected negatively by the financial crisis in the United States. Yeah,
sure, but we don't have enough power in these data anyway There is an interesting, this is the period of the financial crisis. It does cycle up just a little bit, especially for the women. But, you know, it's really driven by these 2012 data points. And that's when we were already coming out of it. So what you know, I really don't know. We don't have enough data to be that annually precise to precise. This is something that's okay for decade to decade. There's just not enough information there. Now.
So going back to the last figure, not this one, the one before. Yep, wait.
Oh, one more?
The next one?
This one or the one before?
The next one, the one that shows education.
Oh, education, sorry.
So you said that 25% of the variance, like there's a lot more. So like, did you look at racial differences and like you found no difference at all?
African Americans underachieve relative to the other three groups of the same gender and education, but that's really it. They're all on the same slope.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like, in terms of like the points that are below, like the few like points that are below, are they of a particular race then?
Oh, I see. Yeah, we could use a color code to check that. I don't think so, or it would have shown up in the statistical analysis as a different pattern for the African American dots on the chart than the white or Hispanic dots on the chart. Yeah. That's why that finding on this chart, it says racial differences are additive, subtractive, depends on your focus here, but at every origin, African Americans get jobs that are of lower rank. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's janitors' sons and daughters or professors' sons and daughters. They're all paying getting a decrement, whereas the other three groups are pretty much all in the same on the same line. Yes.
Could you go back to the slides with the rankings of the occupations?
Sure. Just the health ones, or did you want something else?
Yeah, this one. So the ones that are below, so the occupations that are at the bottom, they are very much racialized and gendered. So at least that's what I would guess from my previous studies. So how much do you think that would have an impact?
Well, that's why I thought that there might be different slopes for different groups, but in fact, the pattern is the same. Privilege reproduces itself, disadvantage reproduces itself equally within all four groups. African Americans are ranked across the board significantly lower than people from other groups, but and then maybe this was a point I gave in too technical a language. I noted that all of the difference between Hispanics and whites is accounted for by the origin distribution. So it's absolutely true that there are more Hispanics than whites proportionally in these occupations within the health field than in these occupations. But the disparity is exactly the disparity you would expect based on the fact that the parents of the Hispanic workers are also disadvantaged relative to the white ones. And so the intergenerational correspondence is the same. It's just that Hispanics start out behind, a generation later they're behind by the amount you'd expect based on the pattern among the whites who start ahead and stay ahead.
But also in terms of gender,
if
this is ranked based on what people think about it, are they also ranked lower because they are mostly done by women?
Yeah, so in addition, okay, so then we need to go to these regressions. In addition to these regressions, in the paper on the GSS website where we report these scales and document the scales, we added percent unemployed, percent black, percent Latino, and percent female to the regressions and found zeros for all 4 of those variables. So people's ratings of the occupations are proportional to their pay and credentials, but people aren't taking into account the composition, the demographic, racial, or gender composition of the occupations when they decide this is a good job or a bad job, or a high status job or a low status job. The word in the prompt for the ranking exercise is high social standing or low social standing. They're actually given a ladder and a business card, and on the business card the job is described, and they're asked to put it on the rung of a ladder. And the ladders are numbered from 0 to 10. 1 to 10.
But don't people in the United States have sorry for taking this first time, but don't they already have an image in their head of, let's say, a maid or a housekeeper being of particular gender?
Probably.
Ethnicity?
Yeah,
so
probably.
You cannot separate the two.
Well, yeah, you can. If you look at the jobs that have a lot of women doing them and compare them with the jobs that have very few, that neither adds to nor subtracts from the social ranking of the job relative to the pay, which may reflect employers' discriminatory behavior, and credentials, which generally work to the advantage of women but not for blacks and Hispanics. And so it's absorbed in the pay, what they know about the pay and credentials of the job, not their image. You know, if we ask them, they might, you know, would you draw me one? You know, draw me a person sweeping up at the hospital and draw me somebody in the operating room at the hospital. They might color them differently or draw a man or a woman differently, but the signal, the information they have is absorbed in the pay and credentials of those 2 positions. It's not in that stereotype they might have about who might be doing that kind of job. Well, at this point then, I guess it's time to thank you all very much for your attention. And when and if